you so much. Well, again, it's such a pleasure to be welcoming you today to the second in the series on dialogue innovation. And our dialogue innovation team is Beth Resnick, Michelle Duren, and I. And our goal is to create a space on campus where we can talk about the role of religion in public health. And this is the Public Health and Religion Dialogue Seminar Series. And it's my real pleasure to welcome Professor Hahrie Han. Hahrie is, in my view, one of our university's leading scholars in her own right, but also one of the nation's leading scholars on civic participation, organizing, and democracy. At Hopkins, she serves as the inaugural director of the Agora Institute and is the professor of political science. But she's also recently, congratulations, Hahrie, been awarded the MacArthur Fellowship, which is a very prestigious award. And we're so excited for you for that. And many of us celebrated at that announcement. And much of her work has been to help us understand how communities build commitment, organize for action, and participate in civic life. And so today, she's going to be speaking on understanding religion as a civic institution, evangelical megachurches, and civic action. And this is a fitting topic for our series because it helps us think about religion not only as a personal kind of domain, but also as an institution and civic force that helps shape our participation and connection. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Hahrie Han.
Thank you, Jonathan. So it's really nice to be here. It's really nice, Jonathan, for you to invite me. So thank you for the invitation. And it's really good to see new friends and also some familiar names and faces. And so I'm really excited for the conversation. Um, so as Jonathan said, what I wanted to do is present some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing, particularly focused on evangelical megachurches in the United States, but kind of thinking more broadly about this question of the role that faith institutions play as like civic entities, so not only as crucibles of formation and theology, but also as crucibles of preparation for democratic, small d democratic life. Um, and so I do have a slide deck that I was going to walk through, but the norms in my field are such that I'm actually very happy to be interrupted along the way. And so I don't know what the norms are here, but I know it's a little more awkward on Zoom, but if people have questions, if they want to either just like use the raise hand function or pop into the chat, I'm pretty happy to take the discussion in whatever directions are of interest to people. So please feel free to interrupt along the way. But let me share slides. Sorry, I'm like a little discombobulated because I literally just got off the train. So let me just get my slides up. Okay, is that working? Can people see the slides? Yes. Okay,
Terrific.
great. Okay, so this is work that's co-authored with, or it's actually not all published, so it's all kind of in progress, but it's collaborative with Matt Denney, Milan de Vries, and Emory Paul, who are all people that work in my research lab. We call it the P3 lab because we're dedicated to trying to understand how you make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful. So people have to be able to participate, they have to want to participate, and it has to actually matter. And so a lot of what we do is partner with different kinds of constituency-based organizations, primarily in the United States, but also around the world, to basically try to scaffold their activity and put data and learning around their work to try to understand how we strengthen their ability to bring people into public life in ways that strengthen communities, public outcomes, that kind of a thing. And we've done a lot of work over the years with different faith institutions. Primarily, I think it grew out of some of my own personal interests in the role of faith in public life, but then also having worked a lot with faith-based community organizers and the role that they played in kind of helping to shape a lot of social movements in the United States. And that broadened into a broader project looking at faith institutions and churches in particular as crucibles of civic formation. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And the question kind of, that sort of animates this body of work in a way is really this question of, how churches, but really I'm really interested more broadly in other kind of civil society organizations in general, how they cultivate democratic culture and norms or not. And so, for people who are paying attention, American democracy and democracy around the world, feels like it's under threat right now. And I think one of the things that people have realized in the past maybe 5, 10 years, and my people, I mean, including like people in my world, political scientists, people who study this, um, is that the kind of culture and the norms that we thought that Americans held about democracy are not nearly as robust or as strong as people thought they were, that people are really willing to give up a lot. And for me, that's kind of raised this question of how that relates to the decline in our civic culture. Alexis de Tocqueville is like a democratic theorist who, from kind of has this phrase that people in my world use a lot, which is this idea that civil society organizations, and he focuses a lot on religious institutions as well, should be what he calls, quote, great free schools of democracy, right? That by going to church with our neighbors, with fellow congregants, that we learn kind of the habits and proclivities that make small d democracy possible and make it work. And we essentially learn kind of the skills and the habits and develop the motivations that we need to try to work with other people to figure out how do we forge a common life together. And that work of forging a common life together is ultimately, to me, what democracy is really about. But part of what we're seeing, I think, in the U.S. in the past, decade and around the world in a lot of places is that we've starved the institutions or the structures that really cultivate that culture of democracy. And in some ways, one way to interpret the moment that we're in is that we're facing the consequences of that, so that when people aren't as committed to it as we thought they were, then what happens? And I think that I'm particularly interested in faith institutions as crucibles of kind of preparation for democratic life. And I'll talk about why in just a second. But before I kind of dive into that, the one thing I want to sort of say is that if I were to think kind of broadly about the body of work that I've done, looking at like social movements and political campaigns and civil society organizations and all this kind of stuff, like if I were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, which I hope doesn't happen, like the one thing that I hope people take away from my work is this idea that like how we engage people in collective action or public life affects what we're able to accomplish together. And so as I began to think about this question of how we think about, what are the conditions under which churches can be crucibles of democracy or not, I was sort of, kind of thinking about this lesson that like, well, one of the things that we know from a lot of other work that it's not just that we get people involved, like it's not just that we ask people to come to services on Sunday or be part of their church community, but it's really about, how we get them involved that really affects whether or not we're going to see the kind of outcomes that we want or not. And so part of what we're trying to do in this project is kind of open up that black box of churches and faith institutions to think not just like whether they're getting people involved, but also how it is that that's operating. Because it's like, because we believe that like opening up that black box is really where the kind of juice is. Okay, so I see a couple questions. So someone said, I was curious to know how I became interested in researching the subject, and then the implications of the drift towards Christian nationalism. Yes. Okay, so just first kind of about how I got into this. So I grew up in my parents immigrated from Korea to the United States, and I grew up in Texas. My parents were kind of culturally Buddhist because they left Korea at a time when, like most people, kind of Confucian Buddhist traditions were sort of pervasive within the culture. But I grew up going to Catholic schools, and so I sort of had this very mixed and kind of confusing faith upbringing because I was like going to mass, at school, like every Friday and every, prayer services every Wednesday. And I had, 12 years of Catholic theology, sort of poured into my brain. But then the practices and the kind of culture that I was raised with at home was really more of a kind of Confucian Buddhist culture. And so I think because of that, it's almost like when things are not, when you're a kid, okay, like when you're a kid, you don't know that the world is different than the world that you know, at least for me, right? Like I just assumed that everyone had like a life like that. But because the faith was something that was not, like it wasn't naturalized. It wasn't like everyone around me is Catholic or everyone around me is Buddhist or everyone around me is like anything. It was always something that I was kind of curious about. And I think the kind of differences between the different faith traditions that I grew up with also made me curious about faith in a way that maybe I wouldn't have been if I had just been raised in one tradition. So that's sort of where I really got into it. But then I got interested in politics and community organizing and that kind of thing in college when I got involved in student activism, actually with Jenny Ozer, who's on this call. Jenny and I went to college together, and we got involved in student activism together in college, and that's what got me interested in this work. And so then I think when I got interested in political science, one of the things I was really interested in is the relationship between faith and politics, and so it sort of fused some of those interests together. Um, and David, on your question about Christian nationalism in the White House, like, can we just? I'm going to hold on that for a little bit because I have. Let me give some orienting data first, and then we'll talk about the kind of political implications of our current politics. Okay. So what I want to do today is kind of give just sort of like a preliminary overview of some of the work that my team and I have been doing on this question about how we think about churches as crucibles of democratic preparation or not. And there's sort of 4 different data sources that I want to draw on. And so, like I said, I'm happy for the discussion to really go in whatever direction. So if people end up like wanting to dive into one or the other, I'm happy to do that. The first is the last book that I did is this book called Undivided, which traces people who are organizing around racial justice within the 3rd largest evangelical megachurch in America. And so I have a lot of qualitative data about that. Can definitely talk about Joel Osteen's church. And then second, I also wanted to draw on some data that we've been collecting at the SNF Agora Institute. We have a project called Mapping the Modern Agora, where basically what we're trying to do is use a lot of computational tools and big data to essentially create a map of civic infrastructure in the United States. And the main point that I wanted to sort of draw from that is that is just the importance of faith institutions in our civic life. And I think this data just illustrates that really well. And then third, we have this new data set that we haven't fully collected yet, but basically my colleagues and I have been we're working with the Data Science and AI Initiative here at Hopkins to collect sermon data from the 1,300 largest megachurches in America. And so starting around COVID, all these churches started putting their sermons online. And so now you can kind of like gather all that data, scrape it, transcribe it. And then we have this huge corpus of data that essentially tells us like what are the 1,300 largest megachurches saying to their congregants on Sunday. And then we also have survey data that we collected with that has a nationally representative sample of American adults, but also an oversample of evangelicals. That's particularly where we're doing some of our work. So I'm going to try to put some of these pieces together for you. But to start, I'm going to skip this, and I'm just going to dive into the data a little bit. And to Kim's question, yes, the data was, we're using a lot of like machine learning tools to essentially analyze the sermon data, because it's just like, it's way too much data to have any one person like read all of it. And so I'll talk a little bit about that data in a second, but I just want to show you the mapping the Modern Agora data first, because the main point that comes out of this essentially is that faith institutions play a huge role in our civil society, I think even more than most people understand. And so what Mapping the Modern Agora did is essentially started with the IRS master database, which lists all the nonprofit organizations in the United States. And for those of you who kind of know nonprofit law, faith institutions, churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, they are listed in the IRS master database, but they don't have to file a formal tax form, which is called the 990 form, because the 990 form is what nonprofits file to sort of show what their revenue and expenditures are and stuff like that. And it's kind of controversial that faith institutions don't have to file them. But what we were able to do in Mapping the Modern Agora is essentially start with the IRS master database and then take that information and then scrape website data and social media data and all this other information that essentially allowed us to get a look into civic life that included faith institutions in a way that wasn't really previously possible. So previous work that had looked at civil society organizations often had to rely on 990 forms, which meant that they severely undercounted faith institutions because most churches don't file their 990 forms because they're not legally required to do so. And we were able to kind of gather that using a lot of computational tools. And so basically what we did based on all this data is that we took the body of all the nonprofit organizations in the United States, and then we're able to go around and say, okay, now which of these are actually providing civic opportunity in their communities? And what I mean by civic opportunity is like, what are the organizations that are actually inviting people into activities in which they might encounter each other, like other humans, you know? And so, for example, right, like Johns Hopkins University is a nonprofit organization. It'll be listed in the IRS database. We will file, you know, Johns Hopkins files a 990 form, like all that kind of stuff. We wouldn't necessarily think of it as like a high civic opportunity providing institution. Now, I know you can quibble with that, like, you know, at the Agora Institute and other places, like we have events and we technically invite the public and all those kind of things, but it's not the primary job of what Johns Hopkins does. Whereas an organization like Threads, for example, I don't know if you guys know that, in Baltimore, they're like constantly engaging people or in or like Builds, a big community organizing group in Baltimore. Their whole orientation is trying to organize events and activities that engage people in public life. And so what we did was essentially created an index of the organizations that are providing civic opportunity to people. And what we find essentially is that faith-based institutions rival social and fraternal organizations as being the top providers of civic opportunity in most counties in America. So I don't have the exact numbers right, but I think I'm very close. In like 80% of counties in America, the top providers of civic opportunity are either faith institutions or social fraternal organizations. So social fraternal organizations are like actual sororities and fraternities, or like Rotary clubs, ethnic clubs, immigrant homebound associations. Like those kind of clubs are all kind of categorized as social fraternal organizations. And those kinds of organizations and faith institutions are the top providers of civic opportunity in most counties in America. And so what that tells us is just that, you know, even if we don't hear about like Redeemer Episcopal in the news all the time, you know, as much as we hear about like the Sierra Club or the NRA or other organizations like that, that actually these faith institutions are kind of the engines of civic life in a lot of ways still in their communities. And the other piece of data that I'll give you is that even if we were to look at other kinds of organizations that are in our data, so here we can look at like youth serving organizations, community-based groups, health organizations, housing organizations, organizations dedicated to like housing or education or whatever, that somewhere between anywhere from like, you know, 20 to 40% of these other types of organizations have a Christian inflected mission, right? So what that means is that, for example, about 35% of health survey or like health oriented organizations in the US have some kind of Christian orientation attached to them, you know? And so this is just a way of saying that it's not just that faith institutions are providing a ton of civic opportunity and inviting people into these kind of encounters with other people, but also they're providing a lot of the social services that our nonprofit institutions provide. And so this is all just like a long way of saying that, like, you know, that's one of the many reasons why I think they're like important to study. And we ended up focusing on megachurches for a variety of different reasons. First of all, just because church attendance has gotten heavily skewed towards megachurches in America. So data from Duke, the National Congregation Survey study, argues that the top 9% of churches by size contain 50% of the church-going population in the United States, right? So if we really want to understand like what's happening to in churches on Sundays, and looking at the biggest churches is a good way of capturing a large proportion of what people are seeing. And these mega churches are not only drawing a lot of people in, but they are mostly growing. So in the last period that we have data, most mega churches grew by about 20%. And that this data is not on this slide, but like the other data point that I always think about is, I don't have the exact numbers right, but again, I'm close, is like, I think the like median megachurch has like 6,000 members and like a $5 or $6 million a year annual budget, but 96% of its budget comes from individual donations, And so what that means is that people are coming to them, these churches, they're growing, and people are giving. And I just want to be really clear that I'm not making a theological point here. Like, this is an empirical point. So there's obviously a big debate about whether or not having people ensconced in these large churches it has theological value or not. And I think that's a really important question to ask. But I'm thinking about them more as like from a civic institution, like they're drawing more people together more frequently than most of the civic, social, political organizations that we study. And so, just purely as a civic phenomenon, it's something that I'm really interested in trying to understand. Okay, so just to answer a couple of the questions, there's this question about Joel Osteen's church, which I'll talk about in just a second, and I'll get to the sermon questions too. So this is just a map of where megachurches exist in America. Obviously, they exist more in urban areas than rural areas. It's just hard. The largest megachurch in America, I think, is in Ohio. It's the Life Church in Ohio. They get about 80,000 people per week together. A lot of these are multi-site churches, so they have multiple campuses where they stream one service into the campus. But you can't gather 80,000 people in one place. Like, it's just too hard. And so they have multiple sites through which they gather people. And the other point to make is, for someone like me who grew up going to Catholic church, which, was usually like a building that had a steeple and there was an altar and there's like a priest in vestments and like a very formal, pews, like a kind of formal service. Like, these mega churches are not at all that kind of experience. And so the church that I spent the most time in is this church called the Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was at one time the third largest church in America. And, it like many other megachurches, like their actual building is basically like a converted strip mall. And so the pictures on the bottom are pictures of, it used to be a home goods store. And when the home goods store went out of business, they bought the building and essentially converted it into a church, So it basically took this like big box store and converted it into a church. And the picture on the right is, like the church services themselves are these like multimedia affairs. And again, for someone who grew up Catholic like me, where the sermon is actually a pretty small part of the Mass, the sermon is like the main part, of the Mass here, alongside a lot of they almost always have bands and alongside a lot of other music and things like that. And then the picture on the top left, the black pastor is my friend Chuck, and the head pastor of the Crossroads Church is the white guy Brian Tome. And this is just an image of them. Like, one of the things they do on Super Bowl Sunday to try to combat low church attendance on Sundays is Crossroads hosts like a Super Bowl of preaching, which is just, I'm giving you this picture to kind of give you a sense of like the way in which they use entertainment as a way of trying to draw people in. And so they set up like an actual Super Bowl of preaching. They take their most popular preachers, Chuck and Brian, and they put them on different teams and they have a preach off. They organize it into quarters. They have like actual NFL players come and be commentators. They have referees. They make their own commercials. Like, it's a very, hugely produced affair, and they draw in about 100,000 people on Super Bowl Sunday to watch the Super Bowl of preaching because it's like turned into such a big deal. And so these mega churches just create like a very different kind of both cultural, religious, social experience than certainly what I grew up with, having gone to Catholic churches in Texas. And to the question that was in the chat about Joel Osteen. So Joel Osteen is a megachurch preacher in Houston, Texas, which is where I grew up. He is most closely associated with what's called the prosperity gospel. And for a lot of people who only have like a secular understanding of evangelicalism, usually what they hear about, if all you read is like the New York Times, is prosperity gospel preachers, right? Which are prosperity gospel is a controversial part of evangelicalism that basically associates personal wealth with faith in God, and so the idea is that like if you are faithful and if you're a person of faith, then like God will reward you with riches, essentially. And it's prosperity gospel has taken hold in a lot of parts of like countries like Brazil and Nigeria and countries where we see evangelicalism growing a lot in these like huge kind of like megachurch communities. But it also exists in the United States. I haven't seen good data on what percentage of evangelical churches are actually prosperity gospel, but I will say like churches like Crossroads, for example, which is the third largest church in America, they would actively reject prosperity gospel theology, so it's controversial within evangelicalism. Joel Osteen is one of the most famous kind of prosperity gospel preachers, and it's worth noting that the first evangelical preachers to endorse Trump back in 2015, 2016, when he was first running, were prosperity gospel preachers, and so it was like there was a certain strand of evangelicalism that began to tie, white evangelicalism to Trump. And that has it's since very much expanded, just to be really clear. But that's sort of like where it began, and that's where Joel Osteen kind of fits into this landscape. But from an image standpoint, like if you look at pictures of Joel Osteen preaching, it looks a lot like the pictures that I have on the screen for you now. Um, okay. Okay, maybe I'll keep going. So then this kind of gets to the next question that's in the chat about the sermon data. Okay, so then the question is, okay, so if you buy the argument that like these churches are like these faith institutions are engines of civic life in a lot of communities in America, that they are prevalent in a lot of our civic infrastructure, and that megachurches in particular are really kind of like a growing force within American Christianity, then the question is, okay, so what's happening in those megachurches? And that's what we're trying to look at with this sermon data. And so what we did was we identified that we have a little over 1,300 of the largest megachurches in America. The data that I'm going to show you today is just the last 2 years of data. So it's 2024 and 2025. So it captures one election year, right? And then the first year of the Trump administration. There's about 445,000 videos. It's 365,000 hours. The thing to me that was kind of surprising that I didn't really anticipate until after we looked at the data is that if you add up all these sermons, which are all basically on YouTube, it had 1.1 billion views, which if you break it down, it rivals like mainstream media sources in terms of the number of people who are watching these videos. And so in 2024, which is during an election year, Fox News, was at the very top of the heap in terms of like Fox News Online had about 233 million monthly views. The New York Times had 10 million monthly views. And so that means that the mega churches, these sermons are getting more views than the New York Times, fewer views than Fox News, So it's like somewhere between the New York Times and the Fox News in terms of the amount of views that they're getting. So again, for me as a political scientist, just trying to understand them as like a source of of socio-political content, they're reaching way more people than something like the New York Times, which scholars spend a ton of time studying. And and then also it's just it's like there's 3.7 amens in there, 1.7 million hallelujahs, and so we can kind of like look at all this data to sort of see like what it is that they're talking about. And the thing that I thought was really interesting coming out of this is that, again, I think a lot of people would assume that these churches are way more political than they are. But if we essentially just kind of did a sort of general analysis of where we use machine learning and AI tools to sort of say, what are the themes that each of these sermons are talking about? If you look at the kind of top themes that come out, they're much more grounded in kind of like theology and Christian lifestyle than they are about politics, right? So there's a lot about repentance and sin, and about faith and the Holy Spirit and church and the importance of building community, about worship, and all of these different kind of themes that I think would be consistent with what we'd expect of faith institutions in a lot of ways. And I'm going to skip this for now for a second, just examples. And if we sort of kind of said, like, instead of doing like a more unsupervised analysis, we did a supervised topic analysis. We're sort of said, like, here's a set of topics, and we want to know how much you just like mention one of these topics. So this isn't like you're going to thematically discuss and have a whole sermon about repentance and sin. It's more like, do you mention marriage and family at all, right? Do you mention sexuality and gender at all? And, again, we sort of see that, like, about a third of the sermons mention marriage and family, about a fifth of the sermons mention politics and government in some way. But I'll give you some examples of how that is, because it's not necessarily as partisan as people might necessarily think. Okay, here's a question. I'm not sure how to frame the question, but if it were otherwise, would there be a separation of church and state conflict? So, okay, so separation in church and state is like super interesting, and as people know, it's one of these things that's been contested in terms of how the Supreme Court has ruled on it over the 250 years of American history, and so the court has ruled different ways on how we think about the separation of church and state alongside freedom of religion, both of those being hallowed principles that are both in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and in general, I think that the way that current practice I'm like definitely not a lawyer, so I'm trying to like want to say this very carefully because I'm sure there's someone who's like a better constitutional scholar on here than I am. But in terms of how current practice is that churches are, up until there was a rules change that just happened within the last 12 months from the Trump administration, that churches are not supposed to do anything that's partisan, but they basically have to follow the same kind of rules that other nonprofit organizations do, which is that they can engage in civic activity, but not partisan political activity, right? And so Johns Hopkins University, as a nonprofit organization, we can register students to vote. We can encourage them to get involved in their communities, right? All of those are civic things that we think are good for small d democracy. But we can't sort of say you should register to vote and you should all register as Republicans or you should all register as Democrats or something like that. And similarly, churches, are saying now the Trump administration just issued a ruling that changed some of that, and so we have to see how that's going to play out. But that's currently kind of the way a lot of this exists. Um, but the other thing that what I want to show you is that the other thing that we did was we wanted to see like how often are these churches actually mentioning Trump as a candidate or something like that, because I could mention him in lots of different ways without making any kind of partisan claims. And what we see is that just the bottom line just shows you how often like Charlie Kirk is mentioned, just as a way of like grounding the data. And basically it's like no one's mentioning Charlie Kirk until the month that he got assassinated, and then all of a sudden we see there's like a lot of mentions in October of 25 or September of 25, but that he's not really being mentioned otherwise. And Trump is also mentioned a lot less than I think most people would commonly assume. So even through the election year, we see 20% or less approximately of churches are actually mentioning his name. And I'll give you some data in just a second that shows a lot of times they're mentioning his name and they're not saying, and he's awful or and he's great. They're just saying, like there's an uptick in mentions of him when there was the assassination attempt in June of 24, right? And then there's an uptick around the election in November, December of 24. But even then, the mentions of Trump were much lower than, for example, the mention of the word secular, right? So what we see a lot more of in these sermons is that instead of engaging in a lot of political content, what they're doing is they're sort of helping to cultivate like a Christian identity among the people who are coming. And so they're saying things like, the secular world, we Christians are different from the secular world, right? And so that's getting more mention than Trump as president or Trump as candidate. A ton of mention of family, a ton of mention of poverty, right? Because Jesus spoke a lot about poverty in the Bible. And so, so again, like part of what we were seeing in this data is that it's not as, and this kind of gets the question, David, that you asked early on, that like, despite all the things that we see about white Christian nationalism and the ways in which a lot of white evangelicals, adhere to sort of views on Christian nationalism and things like that, it's at the cultivation of the sort of strong political linkages between faith and politics are not necessarily happening in the sermons. There are a small percentage of churches where that is happening a lot, but the vast majority of churches are talking a lot more about kind of traditional theological topics, but a lot of Christian lifestyle kind of topics as well. And so just to kind of give you some data, some specific data on this. And so this looks at the sentiment of mentions of Trump. And so, even among the kind of 20% or less fewer sermons that were mentioning Trump, that the most of those mentions are pretty neutral. There are some that are positive and there are some that are negative. And so this data includes, the megachurches they're mostly white evangelical churches. There's a few black evangelical churches that tend to be more critical of Trump, and then some mixed race churches in there. And then these are just some examples of some of the mentions. And so, here you sort of see the Spotswood Baptist Church in Virginia. It's a 2,000 person church. And, he sort of mentions Trump. We want to continue to pray for President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, blah, 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 blah. But we pray that they model their lives and their decisions based on the principles and truths that we find in the Bible, right? The World Outreach Church in Tennessee, that like, yes, they mention, he sort of says like, yes, Trump is not going to be the savior because we have to be beholden to God, right? Like not the GOP. The James River Church in Missouri, again, like he'll say, last week our country elected a president. I think it's really important for Christians to understand that like we vote, but God picks a president, right? God picked Joe Biden, God picked Trump, God picked Barack Obama, and he goes through and lists all the presidents, right? And then you might say, well, if God's the one picking the president, then why am I voting? And it's like, well, because we have an opportunity to participate with the purposes of God, right? And so what they're doing is even when they're talking about political activity, they're talking about it in the context of this relationship to faith, in the primacy of God as the as who should be the kind of ultimate arbiter. And so part of what actually, maybe I'll pause for a second there, and then I was going to get into some part of what I think I'm beginning to see in some of the data. But maybe I'll pause and see if people have other questions before I get into some of the more qualitative data and the survey data. Do other people have questions that they want to ask before I dive in? Keep going. Are we good? Okay. You guys are like a lot nicer than most political scientists where I talk about this. So, okay. Someone just put in a question. Also curious what AI software. Like we're essentially like just like we're creating our own machine learning analyses. So we're not like using ChatGPT or something like that. If that's what you meant, like we have such a huge corpus of data that we're essentially just writing our own code to try to analyze it. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So part of then, I think, one of the things I talk a lot about when I talk not only about faith institutions, but, any kind of civic organization, is the idea that to really understand what's happening in terms of the role these organizations play in democracy, we have to understand both the kind of supply and the demand side, right? So supply is like, what is the flow of opportunities that people are being invited into? And then the demand side is how are people reacting to it, And so the sermons is really kind of like a supply side question, right? Like what is the distribution of megachurches across America? What are they saying from the pulpit? And I think like part of what I'm coming to understand, I think, through this is that a lot of what's happening is the sermons, I think, are doing what I think of as like tilling the soil, right? So they are kind of laying the foundation that for what prepares people for civic life. And then elsewhere, people are then connecting that to explicit like institutional politics in different ways. And so one way, part of this comes out of some of the sermon data that I just showed you, and part of this comes out of this qualitative project that I did with Undivided, which is the organization that was doing work organizing people around racial justice in Crossroads. And in both the patterns that we see in the sermon data and both what I saw in Undivided, I think what we see is that a lot of what's happening in the churches, both at the level of like small group programs like Undivided, but also in terms of what's being preached from the pulpit, is that there's a lot of work that's being done around identity formation, like asking people to think about what it means to be Christian, what it means to be part of this community, what it means to be Christian in a secular world, like all these different kind of things. In the case of Undivided, it's like what it means to be a Black Christian or a person who cares about racial justice or something like that, right? And that's linked to a set of practices and rituals that are embedded into church, right? So a lot of these churches are inviting people not just to services on Sunday, but like a whole suite of activities, right, that try to provide kind of like wraparound embeddedness in people's lives. And so it's a lot of the language is around identity formation, and that's grounded in a set of practices and rituals that sort of give people an experiential sense of it. And then what happens is then through other sources, whether it's Fox News or parachurch organizations like the Christian Coalition or other places, once that soil is tilled, then there's like another process of linking that to belief in some ways, political beliefs in different ways. And so I think that the kind of politicization of parts of evangelicalism is really grounded in this like multi-step process that we're seeing. And, so part of what I'm going to skip this because it's going to take too long. This is just trying to get into like some of the micro practices in Undivided and like how it was that they were able to do it. Um, but I'll just sort of say that if we, in the survey data that we gathered, and we did a survey last October, it was October, November, a November survey of 3,500 American adults. It was a representative sample of American adults plus an oversample of evangelicals. And we tried to ask a lot about some of these kind of practices to understand like how it was that people were making sense of it. And I'm happy to show you lots of other descriptive stuff on the data, but I just want to show you these last two slides before I like take the slides down, which is that one of the kind of more surprising findings that we found from the survey data is that the more people attend church conditional on sort of how they think about the relationship between their political identity and their Christian identity, the more likely they are to support democratic norms, right? And so there are a lot of people evangelicals, who would say that their Christian identity is more important to them than their political identity. That's a light green line. They were the ones who were most likely to see the strong association between high church attendance and increased support for democratic norms. There are some people who identify as evangelical, but they say their political identity is more important than their Christian identity, and that's about anywhere from a fourth to about like a fifth to a fourth, 20 to 25% of people who identify as evangelical. In many cases, they don't believe in the core theological beliefs of evangelicalism, right? But they adhere to the political identity. And then what we see is in that population is that church attendance is not correlated at all with support for democratic norms. And for people for whom it's like relatively equal, again, we see that same pattern. And then to the question about Christian nationalism, again, we sort of see this complex relationship between identity, church attendance, and belief in Christian nationalism. So for people who prioritize political belief identities over Christian identities, right? So these are people who adhere to the political identity associated with evangelicalism, but don't necessarily buy into the theological beliefs that underlie evangelicalism. Then the more they attend church, the more likely they are to support Christian nationalism, right? But for people who prioritize their Christian identities above their political identities, attending church actually is associated with decreased support for Christian nationalism. And so there's kind of this complicated relationship, I think, that's bringing us back to this kind of, sort of tripartite sort of relationship between like, what is it that people believe, both from a theological and a political sense, and how does that grow out of this soil that's tilled and the kind of practices that are engaged with in the church and the identities that are formed. And I'll just sort of end by saying this is not inconsistent with a lot of the other work that I've done where I've looked at what the impact of community organizing is on a lot of different outcomes. But there's this one paper that two other political scientists and I did where we basically did, as far as I know, it's the only randomized control trial of community organizing. No one's read this paper. It's like one of my favorite papers and like no one's ever read it. But it's the only randomized control trial of community organizing. It was like a multi-year study. It took us forever. It took like 6 years because we failed the first time. We had to redo the whole study and blah, 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 like all this kind of stuff. But basically what we found is that if we randomized public housing developments in Ohio into treatment and control, and treatment basically got community organizing for a year, and control got no organizing for a year, and then we went right before an election and essentially did like get out the vote efforts in both treatment and control. What you find is that the communities that have been organized are much more open, and the effects of GOTV in the treatment communities are more effective than they are in the control communities, right? And so to me, this is the same kind of idea as like what's happening in these churches, is that the churches are kind of tilling the soil, right? In the same way that community organizing was sort of tilling the soil in terms of preparing people for democratic life. And then some other effort is coming along and then linking that to institutional politics, right? So in the case of our study, it was an explicit get out the vote effort. I think in a lot of the churches, sometimes it is a get out the vote effort through like Christian Coalition and other kind of parachurch organizations. Other times I think it's things like content from Fox News and elsewhere that's coming along and linking the kind of you know, people in the congregants to institutional politics. But anyways, this is just like a long way of thank you, Jenny, for reading the paper. This is just a long way of saying that I think there's just like a lot that we're still trying to unpack and trying to understand what the relationship is between how faith institutions and these churches in particular are kind of pulling people off the sidelines into public life, what's happening within the churches themselves, and then what what's happening kind of like in other parts of American political culture. So I'll stop there and then see if people have other things they want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Hari. A terrific, sweeping kind of analysis of religious engagement and participation and kind of some nuance that I think perhaps if you aren't kind of carefully looking at the data and understanding it empirically can be missed. That actually it's not necessarily a one-to-one engagement with evangelical churches that is mapping onto Christian nationalism, which is very, very refreshing to see kind of empirically. There's a couple of questions that popped up. One from Selvi, which is how do you discern whether a given way a church engages congregants is supportive of democracy versus not?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really complicated question that I think even like political scientists would probably disagree on. So what I will say is that there's a lot of research that shows that civil society organizations can be carriers of democracy or carriers of authoritarianism. So, for example, there's a lot of work on the Weimar Republic in the 1930s that basically showed that civil society was actually quite thick and quite robust during that period of time. And of course, it became a carrier for Nazism, right, which is not at all, right? Normatively appealing in any way, obviously. And so civil society is neutral in the sense that it can be a carrier for either. I think part of what we were undertaking in this project is trying to understand, okay, if we look transnationally, we look historically, then we can look back and say, oh, it turns out that civil society organizations in the Weimar Republic were actually quite detrimental to society in a lot of ways. But what ends up happening is that people look retrospectively at the organizations and then make that assessment. And I think part of what we're learning in this moment right now, given the fragility of democracy around the world, is that we need to be able to have tools to understand not just what it looks like retrospectively. We go back and we say like, gosh, it turns out actually that was like a very authoritarian thing, nor can it be tied to ideology, right? It can't just be like people I agree with are democratic and people I disagree with are not democratic, right? And so we have to have tools to try to understand, what are the kind of practices that we think of as being small d democratic or not. And so that's a little bit part of what that part of the question that underlies some of this project. And so, that's why we were interested in looking at that question about democratic norms, right? Because one, I think the baseline assumption would have been, to Jonathan's point, that a lot of these evangelical megachurches are probably not cultivating democratic norms at all, right? But actually it turns out that there's a sort of complicated story about how that's interacting with other forces. And so, again, that still leaves open the question of what the practices are. I will say, I personally, and this is like a hypothesis that I have, and I don't know that like my other fellow political scientists would necessarily agree, that I think what's really powerful about what's happening in a lot of these churches is that they're helping people come to understand themselves as agents of political life, of public life, right? So even if it's grounded in this kind of concept of faith, right, it's not necessarily grounded in a concept of partisan politics or democracy per se. Like part of what I saw in Undivided is what made Undivided work is it helped people realize that I can be someone who can help strategize about how to solve problems about racial justice in my community, right? And if I'm a person of faith and I think in the language of Christianity that everyone is a child of God, then that means that I must respect the dignity of all people, which then means that I must do these other things, but I get to be the agent of deciding what that looks like. And that to me in some ways is more small d democratic than a lot of political organizations that we have that essentially try to dictate to people what they should do if they're upset about something, right? So it's like, give me $5 and then let the professionals decide what we're going to do with your money or something like that. And it's not cultivating people's sense of their own agency. So I think that's a little bit of the disconnect that we see in public life more broadly right now. And part of what's making churches really fertile grounds for cultivating people for public life is because they're countercultural to that trend in a lot of ways. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat. So there's a question, Mega. So there are I have not come across mega synagogues that have the same this. I mean, there's a few like really large synagogues, and there's a few really large mosques actually in like in Minnesota and other places, but they don't have they're much fewer and far between than the Protestant megachurches. And there's a few Catholic megachurches too, but again, it's really this non-denominational Protestant um, body that tends to proliferate. The megachurches tend to be a lot more common there. And I should also say, by the way, that there's a reaction within Protestant, non-denominational Protestant evangelicalism. There's a reaction to the megachurches that's happening right now too. And so there's a counter trend of people trying to retreat into micro churches, like much smaller churches that they feel like are more theologically grounded. So just to say that it's not necessarily universal. Um, okay, I think there's another question here about Maha buzzwords. We did not look at Maha buzzwords in the sermons yet, but I will say I don't know if I have this slide in this deck. In the mapping the modern agora data, I don't have this in the deck. We did look at the relationship between civic infrastructure and vaccines. And oh, here, I do have it in this other deck here. Here, I'm just going to show you. This is from a paper that was published in like Nature Human Behavior, I think. And we looked at what the relationship is between civic infrastructure, civic opportunity in a community and vaccine acceptance. And basically, if you look on the left, like what the finding is that, conservative communities are less likely than Republican communities are less likely than Democratic communities to, have high rates of vaccine acceptance, but conditional on partisanship, the more civic opportunity they had in a community, the more likely they were to have higher rates of vaccine acceptance, and so again, and then the graph on the right just looks at sort of the relationship to disinformation. But again, it's kind of reinforcing this idea that like partisanship is still the biggest predictor of something like vaccine acceptance and those kind of public health outcomes, but that civic infrastructure can be an inoculating force in a way relative to partisanship. And we didn't at the time have the specific data on churches, so I haven't looked at that in particular.
So one final question from Michelle.
Do you think of civic opportunity and collective action differently in megachurches as I don't think of it differently in terms of okay, actually, let me say this. I don't think of it differently from a conceptual standpoint. Like I think that churches of any size have this capacity to do a lot of this work. I think what differentiates megachurches is because of their scale, they're able to have a plethora of opportunities and offerings and different ways for people to get involved that it's just that smaller churches just struggle to do, And so one of the things that I always talk to groups about is like my read of the data is that there's no one way to kind of recruit someone into activity the first time, right? That like if I'm an organization trying to get people involved, my strategy is I want to have just like lots of doors open, right? Because like how people are going to find you is often very idiosyncratic and biographical and episodic in different ways. But then the thing that there is, I think, consistent patterns on is like once someone walks in the door, what's the nature of the experience I want them to have, right? If they walk in and they feel isolated and alone or, put off or they feel like it's an acrimonious space or something like that, then they're not going to come back again, right? But if they come in and they feel welcomed and they feel embedded in a social community and they feel like they're part of something bigger, then there's all this data I think that shows that then they're likely to come back. And um, so to the question about like the importance of size, I think it's more that because megachurches have like many more doors that they can open because they just have more scale, but the kind of conceptual underpinning I think is not necessarily different. The other thing that I'll just say on that is when Undivided, the book came out, and I went around, I did a bunch of talks, and you know, the book basically tells the story of like these people who are organizing around racial justice within this megachurch, and had a lot more success than I think a lot of other kind of racial solidarity programs did. And a lot of people would ask the question like, do you think that was possible only because it was in a church, right? And implicit in the question was the idea that because everyone had a common faith in a common God, that's what made it happen. And my answer is actually different, which is that I don't think it's so much that people had common faith in a common God and that's what made that program work. It's more that because these were people who went to church, they had a visceral experience of the value of collective life, right? So they knew that what they were going to do, what they could do together was more than what they could do alone, which is very countercultural in America, in most American communities. But then second, they had a deep belief in the ability of people to transform themselves, right? That's inherent in a lot of like faiths that like, especially in evangelicalism, right? It's like built on this idea of being born again, right? Like if I am in relationship with God, then I can be born anew. And that belief in the ability of people to transform themselves should also be inherent in democracy, right? That's the Tocquevillian great free school of democracy is like we go to these schools of democracy and then we become transformed for public life. But that's something that's gotten really lost in a lot of our public life. And so this is just like a way of saying that I think that notion of transformation is as powerful, and in some ways more powerful in small churches than it is in large churches. But that the kind of plethora of supply is just more available in the large churches than it is in the small churches.
What a profound point to finish on, Hari. The idea, I think one of the kind of enduring challenges here is what feels to me in this country is almost like the hardening of people into their kind of collective ideologies or whatever it may be. But if actually this the kind of the core of this is actually our transformation, our which demands, I think, a degree of humility and the
Yeah.
ability for us to kind of be open to other ideas, to listen, and to put our faith or trust in a higher power in order to kind of change the way we're doing things or the way we've been doing things for a long time. It really actually shines a light on what could be a very hopeful pathway for us as a society and for the country. So really, if we were in a room, I'm going to tell you there would be roaring applause. But please join me in thanking Hari for joining us today on a very thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. It's really a joy. And Hari, thank you for doing this with a Herculean sprint from Union Station to
I'm
the
glad I made it.
Hopkins
Yeah.
Bloomberg Center. Thank you all for joining us. Our next event will be on April 30th at noon. Doug Oman will be speaking on his work on religion and health. We look forward to having you join us. Then it will be in person. And if you have not signed up for our email list, then you'll see it in an announcement, and you'll get the announcement then. So thank you so much, and we'll see you all next time, I hope. Bye for now.